The system builders need those eclecticians to do that, the good parasitic work, so they can then be spurred on to adjust the systems.
Because they introduce novel concepts.
Exactly, right?
Yo! What up, everybody? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we're going to it's going to have a little bit of a somber but celebratory tone. We're going to sort of do a small retrospective on the life and work of Erik Olin Wright, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. He's one of the foremost, if not the foremost, Marxist sociologists of the last, 50 years? 40 years? Definitely of his generation. And he fell quickly to leukemia, was diagnosed, and then a few short months later he passed away. But we are going to talk about the impact of his work, and particularly through the frame of an essay that he wrote. What's it called, Troy? Falling into Marxism?
Yeah, it's Falling into Marxism. I think elsewhere it's called Falling into Marxist Sociology and Choosing to Stay.
Yeah, it's part of a longer autobiography that he wrote that I've skimmed over, where he talks about kind of his trajectory, how he places himself in the academic world, as well as in the kind of larger class struggle. I don't know, it was a really lovely essay. I'd never read it before, so when Troy sent me this particular little compact essay, it was really kind of nice. And we'll probably talk about some of his other works as well, talk about the field of political economy, sociology, activism, and various other related themes. So that is coming very soon.
And also about death, too, dude.
And also about death, yeah, I guess.
Yeah,
I guess
how to
that's
die
a really good
well,
point.
man.
Yeah, I mean, did you read any of his blog entries towards the final part of his life?
Yeah, I was hoping to mention that at some point. I followed it, not the entire time, but over the last several weeks. And yeah, it'll probably be a sticky leaves in the midst of our episode to go check that out. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Cool,
I agree. So first, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors over at Mubi. As we've said over the past few weeks, Mubi is amazing. It's an online streaming service, but not like those other streaming services where you just get a fucking bunch of shit thrown against the wall. These are 30 perfectly curated films, from independent darlings to old Hollywood classics or old regional classics from around the world, to kind of like documentaries that may have flown under the radar, other films that may have passed your purview, but they have a 30-day rotation where a new film comes on every day. It lasts for 30 days. At the end of its rotation, it drops off, which means that there are 30 films for 30 days constantly going on in this like cyclical rotation thing. It's really kind of a cool idea. Kind of creates a sense of urgency, too, to watch a bunch of movies. But so we're going to talk about like our current favorite films or some highlights that are going on right now. Troy, what's going on in your library? As I've said for people in the past, maybe people have missed it. They have different regional libraries. So Troy's in the United States, so his library is different from mine in Australia at the moment. So Troy, what's in your library that's tickling your fancy? Yeah,
what's caught my eye over the last few days is a movie by Ben Wheatley called Sightseers. I have not seen the movie, but Ben Wheatley is a guy you're familiar with, so you can talk about him in a second. But I know him as the guy who made Kill List, which is a movie I really enjoyed. So what do you know about Ben Wheatley?
Well, so the first time I saw Kill List, I was blown away, because it starts off as this kind of cool crime contract killer film, right? And then it turns into this crazy fucking pagan horror film. I don't even know what it is at the end, right? And so I thought it was amazing. So after that, and this is when I was living in the UK at the time, he did a film called A Field in England. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
So it's like a historical psychological thriller, maybe, something along those lines. But it's shot in black and white. It's set during the English Civil War. And it premiered on, I want to say, Film 4 when I was in the UK, and I watched it. And after his success of Kill List, this film was like his next thing. And it's a very artistic, very well crafted story. But again, it's the sort of thing where it's like a mix of genres. And I think that's something he does very well, you know? So like I said, the other one is like a crime film that he mixes with like weird pagan horror shit. And I think he's one of those guys that is very clever And maybe sometimes it gets criticized, I think, for being too conceptually clever, but it hits me right in the sweet spot. And then, of course, he did High Rise and Free Fire, which are films that had a little bit more commercial success. I don't know if you saw High Rise, but it stars Tom Hiddleston, and it's an adaptation of the book by Ballard, High Rise. So it's sort of like a dystopian, anti-capitalist novel and then film. A lot of people didn't like it because they thought it was too much, and I think that that's the one thing that characterizes Ben Wheatley. It's a lot. He gives you a lot of stuff to chew on, but I think it's fucking brilliant. So I think he's a fantastic filmmaker. But yeah, what's going on with him?
Yeah, you would love that criticism as a Deleuzian, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can't be too clever. Form is content.
Well, you know when people are like, they love that sort of, they love the question, like the famous philosophical question, why is there something rather than nothing? That's not the one that gets me. The one that gets me is, why is there so much? That's the one that, like, that's the one that freaks me out. The why is there something rather than nothing one, I'm like, yeah, I get that. But the one that really causes dread and curiosity and anxiety for me is, why is there so much? Like, when I ponder about how big and expansive and complex everything is, that's what freaks me out. So, he's my kind of filmmaker, because he's a lot. And then in my library, it's a little bit different, but they've been doing a close-up, I guess you could call it a retrospective, although he's not dead, but on Michael Haneke, who we talked about his film Funny Games, I think last time, which is a brutal, what is it, a social commentary, satire on the media industry? Is that, or on like the news and media? Like, is that how you would call it?
Yeah, I think even on like watching films in general, especially where, disaster strikes.
Like violent films, yeah.
Yeah.
But he's the director of Cachet and Amour, but the films that they have of his right now on my regional library are Benny's Video, which I've not seen, but I've heard about it, 71 Fragments of a Chronology of Chance, then, of course, Funny Games, and then, hold on, there's one more, Time of the Wolf, which I want to really see, and the description of Time of the Wolf is that it is a post-apocalyptic, sci-fi tinged drama that is supposedly as tense and provocative as anything he's ever done. So these are the kind of things that they do. Haneke, he is Austrian. I didn't know what he was, where he was from last time, but he's like Austrian-German filmmaker, and his films are brutal and visceral and dramatic and tense, and they're doing things like that. So that's kind of what Mubi does. They do a bunch of these types of close-ups or spotlights or retrospectives, as well as like little one-offs that they think will just really interest people. And they're all high-quality films. So check out Mubi.com/owlsatdawn, and you'll get a free 30-day trial. That's Mubi.com/owlsatdawn.
And if you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn. We have a number of things we offered to our patrons at Patreon, including a monthly newsletter that we had out about the middle of every month, bonus episodes, of which we just released one. We recorded about the Oscar nominations. We recorded it before the awards ceremony actually happened, just talking about all the main movies that are nominated. So if you want to check that out, you can become a patron. What else do we offer on Patreon? Bonus episodes.
People can, for the bonus episodes, they can become...
Oh, and the democracy.
Yeah, the democracy, where you can suggest topics for future episodes. And our last episode that we released was on kind of the tension that's going around about, classifying somebody as problematic, and how is it that we're supposed to, or how ought we kind of think through the tension between somebody who is deemed problematic, what does it mean to deem somebody problematic, and then, of course, if that person is like a successful artist or theorist, what does that mean for their work and the consumption of their work, and kind of those things. But of course we do like we always do, and we don't really take the popular discussion, but we unpack that shit. We problematize that shit, man.
Yeah, it was fun to kind of deconstruct the question and
right,
and do the classic philosophical analysis of the question without ever actually getting any answers. My favorite thing.
That's what I do, man.
But before we do anything else, dude,
what up?
We got to do the shitty minute.
Oh yeah.
This is the segment of the show where one of us rants and raves about whatever it is that's grinding our gears this week. So, Austin, what's got you all up in a tizzy?
So, you know that I am a researcher and that I help produce videos for Wisecrack, the YouTube channel, yeah?
I do know this.
So I recently had the privilege, pleasure, joy of helping craft the Starship Troopers video that we recently released.
Yeah, I heard about this.
And it caused a little bit of controversy online. So our take on the video was, kind of what was Paul Verhoeven, the director, doing in this video? Like, what was his approach in making this video? And he clearly says explicitly that he wanted to do a couple of different things. One is he wanted to kind of make fascism look sexy. He wanted to make a film that basically says, and this is a direct quote, that war makes fascists of us all. He wanted to explore the idea of what fascism could mean, but in a way that is non-typical. Right? We genuinely think of fascism as being like ugly and nasty and authoritarian, and people don't have freedom and stuff like that. Verhoeven wanted to do something more nuanced and wanted to make a subtle, nuanced kind of depiction of fascism that made it appealing. So he casts like Casper Van Dien and what's her face? The hot actress from, I forgot her name right now. How did I forget
the
her
redhead,
name?
right?
Well, her too, but I was thinking of the brown-haired one, from Wild Things and Jesus,
Denise Richards, right?
Thank you. My God, Charlie Sheen's ex lady. She was the it girl for a while and a Bond girl, but so he casts all these beautiful people, and then of course Neil Patrick Harris is in it as well. And he casts all these beautiful people, and he creates a sort of like love triangle, and then sort of like a friendship story, and it's basically like Beverly Hills 90210 set in the future, in the context of a particular society. And he wanted to then kind of at the end have it be like a sort of, he pulls the rug out from under you after you've enjoyed this militaristic space romp where he's like, see, this is how seductive fascism can be. Right? Kind of something along those lines. And we talk about various different philosophical concepts in the video. Whatever. So Sargon of Akkad, who's like a famous YouTuber guy, comes out and he's written he did like this hour-and-a-half long analysis of Starship Troopers, and then of course he wrote a response video to our video where he basically says that we completely misunderstood it. And then basically in the comments then all of Sargon's followers started shitting on our video, saying that we completely misunderstood it and that Verhoeven misunderstood Starship Troopers because it's based on a novel by this guy Robert Heinlein, who wasn't actually making a video about fascism, but it was about like this libertarian social democratic community, blah blah blah, whatever. But the point is this: our video was not about Starship Troopers the novel. Our video was not about some Starship Troopers universe that exists as an object of inquiry. Our video was clearly about what was Paul Verhoeven doing. And it's quite explicit throughout the video. And it's about him trying to demonstrate what would it be like if fascism looked sexy? Or how could you kind of subtly make it so that you get caught up into thinking fascistically? Not necessarily as an authoritarian regime, but more as like a logical disposition. How could you get caught up thinking fascistically in a way that would sort of entice you or seduce you? And Paul Verhoeven literally says that he wanted to seduce the audience into kind of thinking fascistically. And so
didn't Verhoeven actually state that he fully understood that his interpretation of his story had basically a disconnect from the original novel?
He didn't read the original novel. Like he literally,
like he didn't give a shit. That wasn't the point.
Exactly. That wasn't the point. He literally, it's like, to even say that it's an adaptation of Starship Troopers the novel is only probably for legal purposes because they had to pay rights.
It's some IP shit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably it. And maybe to like get a couple people on board that were familiar with the IP, something like that. But it has nothing to do with that. But the thing that is really my ultimate shitty mini that I'm so frustrated with is that I really want to have faith that human beings have intelligence and that they are able to actually think reasonably and rationally. But this video just proved to me, or it was just another tick in the opposite box, let's say, of my field of data that I'm collecting through my life that made me view the people in the opposite way, that we are not capable of rational thought. Because the comments that came from like the Sargon supporters, all they did was talk about how we misunderstood it. But why did we misunderstand it? We misunderstood it because it wasn't the novel. That's not what happened in the novel. And they kept talking about the novel and how even Verhoeven misunderstood the novel. To which my response is, who gives a fuck about the novel, guys? That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the Starship Troopers universe. We're talking about Paul Verhoeven's film and what is he doing in the film. And it made me want to pull my goddamn hair out because it was literally the same argument over and over and over again. And when people would respond to them, they'd be like, doesn't matter. He misunderstood the novel, bro. It's like, no, who cares? Even if he did misunderstand the novel, even if he completely, like, totally distorted this supposedly free, liberal, democratic community, which is a debate for another time. That's a completely different debate. I could debate the content and the philosophical merits of the novel completely separately. Even if he completely misunderstood that. That has no bearing whatsoever on Verhoeven's film or our video dissecting what Verhoeven was doing. And I don't understand why people can't get that. And it makes me fear for humanity. Because my whole life is like dedicated to dealing with these concepts and trying to communicate them. And then it makes me bang my head against the wall because then I'm like, well, fuck, it's just pointless, man. What we're doing is pointless. Let's wrap it up. Let's end this podcast. It doesn't matter. We just can't do it. We're just not capable. We're just going to be stuck in our like tribalistic presuppositional biases. And if it feels good, then that's what we're just going to go by. It's just pure impulse now. That's it. I don't know, man. I'm confused and frustrated.
Wait, so are you saying that the comment section of the Wisecrack video was basically like a meta commentary on what you were actually being said in the video about thinking fascistically?
I mean, so the comments, I don't know if they were meta commentary. I think that they just, you know what it was? It was we were talking about baseball and they were talking about cricket, right? And it's basically like them saying, bro, Pedro Martinez is the worst because he doesn't understand how to hit a wicket. It's like, yeah, but that's not what baseball is. And they're like, no, but it doesn't matter because it historically came out of it. And so it's like an adaptation of it or some shit like that. And it'd be like that kind of argument, right? Or like American football, it just doesn't get like rugby, bro. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But we're talking about what American football does or what it can do or what it means or whatever. Like, you don't need to talk about rugby. Like, it has nothing to do with it. Now, if you want to do some sort of cross comparison, that's a completely different form of analysis. That's not what we were doing. We weren't saying in what way is Starship Troopers the universe explored through these various different storytelling devices, one being the novel, one being the film. That's not what we were doing. We were simply saying what Verhoeven was trying to do was to seduce the audience by making them get caught up in some sort of teen drama through these various different motifs or other types of storytelling devices like the buildings Roman and these kind of various different approaches. And then of course we use like some philosophy from Sartre to talk about the idea of anti-Semitism, and then the philosophy of Paul Virilio to talk about the derealization of war and how the kind of like hyper violence that's on display in Starship Troopers almost makes it cartoonish, and what kind of effect does that have? So what is Verhoeven doing when he's doing these things? Which again has nothing to do with the fucking novel. And all these people are like, what? So like this alien invasion from these bugs doesn't merit some sort of response and you're calling these people fascists? But then Verhoeven's whole point is, even if there was an alien invasion, which there's actually no proof in the movie that there's an invasion. I know there is in the novel, but in the film it just seems like a false flag kind of thing, that they're just like it's some sort of meteorite or asteroid hits Earth, and they're like, oh, it must have been sent from the bugs. But there's never any proof that the bugs have technology. There's never any proof or justification that they actually provoked that type of invasion. None of that. It just seems to be some sort of excuse to kind of ramp up their already kind of militaristic endeavors. At least in the film. In the book, maybe different. But in the film, that's what's going on. And the reason is because what Verhoeven's ultimately trying to say is that war makes fascists of us all. Now, maybe he's using the word fascism in a loose way, in a way that's not kind of historically attached to Mussolini or to National Socialism and stuff like that, but he's trying to do something creative. This is a postmodern satire. So, fuck people. Put on your thinking caps and go with us a little bit. Like, embrace what we're saying rather than being so resistant to what it is at the outset. And then if you have a criticism and say, listen, I get what you guys are saying, but we could kind of take it in this direction, that's different. But that's not what people do, because I give up, man. This film broke me. That's what I'm saying. It broke me.
Man, I've never heard you this despondent before.
I know, I'm pumped up, man. I didn't have any caffeine today, so I'm overcompensating.
Did you watch Sargon's response video?
Yeah, I did.
Oh.
And did you watch it?
No, I didn't know it existed.
His video is like twice as long as our actual video, and it's the same thing. He does like this thing where he pauses and then he responds, but again, he's only talking about like this idea of the Starship Troopers universe as though it's some sort of historical reality that needs to be defended. You know what I mean? Like he's saying, no, the Starship Troopers society, that Earth community and the Federation, they are this liberal democratic society. And it's like, motherfucker, even if that's the case, you're only basing that based on your interpretation of the novel. The point is what is Verhoeven doing? And let's just buy what he's trying to do for a minute, and then let's analyze that. And then if you want to go a step further and say, okay, here's why it's ultimately unsuccessful, because he waters down the notion of fascism so much that it makes the term become sort of indistinguishable or something like that. That's a substantive argument, but that's not what he does. That's not what any of the comments did. They just simply tried to like hunker down into their silos to basically dog whistle for their own sort of like resistant position, which was probably a fascist position. I don't know.
There's also, I think, this like general sort of difference of how to do some sort of, or how to have ideas, right?
Right.
Like one's very expositional, which there's a certain segment of people, and it crosses the political spectrum, but it tends to be a little bit more on the right sometimes, that are about exposition. Whereas certainly I think your tendency is much more towards, combination and synthesis and creation and your whole Deleuzean heritage of creating concepts and whatnot. So part of that's, I think, also just those streams don't cross very easily.
No, they don't. They don't.
Yeah,
and I get it. No, go ahead.
Yeah, some self-awareness is required, I think, to do proper, to like deal proper with someone else's content, to kind of know what's the form of it before you go in, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. And I'm being a little bit impatient, of course, obviously, because it's the shitty minute, man.
It's the shitty minute, man. You got to be.
Yeah, it's exactly. You got to get it out, man. This is cathartic. So I'm being a little impatient with people. I do know how difficult it is to try to consume something where it's so entrenched in a culture war, and people are so frustrated with the word fascism that's just thrown around by quote-unquote SJWs, right? Social justice warriors. And so then if you're somebody...
And it is. Like, that's not entirely wrong.
Exactly. And so I get it. If you're somebody who's particularly sensitive to that, you see a video that comes from a platform that, again, is just doing the same thing that everybody else is doing. And so in your mind, you kind of already hunker down into your defense mode, right? And so I get that. But I'm just so frustrated, man. The level of rational discourse. And then so many people came to like our defense, or they were kind of like, guys, like this isn't about the novel, or like this is something different. Like we get what you're saying, but you guys are arguing the wrong point. And their retort was just, nope, you guys just don't get it. And I was like, I can't do this, man. It was so frustrating. Welcome to the internet.
Yeah, just learn my lesson, dude. Just don't talk to people on the internet. Or maybe
I know, but I have maybe ever. I know, but it's that pastor thing, They're lost souls, and
yeah,
I
you're
can
addicted.
save them.
You can't stop.
No, I can't.
All right, so let's jump into the main segment today. As mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about the famous Marxist scholar Erik Olin Wright, who unfortunately passed away this last week. Erik Olin Wright, I didn't even know, Austin apparently was a visiting scholar at Sydney over there with you guys?
Yeah, he was a visiting professor in political economy here, and he recently came and gave a talk about, I'd say 7 months ago, and maybe 8 months ago. And he was talking about sort of the part of the next stage of his development of his Real Utopias project, where he was particularly talking about universal basic income as something that he believed would be part of these four orientations of anti-capitalism. That is the one that he subscribes to, which is this idea of eroding capitalism. And so he was talking a lot about, he talked about cooperatives and unions and universal basic income, and he's trying to constructively, like, reconstruct or build these positive proposals, sort of, I think, maybe in a normative framework that he believes would help us to kind of fill in maybe the interstices of where capitalism doesn't have like a full stranglehold, and you can kind of beef these areas out, and that there are actual concrete policy proposals that can go along with class struggle and union support and indigenous struggles and things like that. So this isn't like an either or thing, but he wants to kind of build out some policy proposals, and so he was talking about that. And yeah. It was, and then we got an email a few months later that he fell sick with leukemia, and then again a few short months later that he had passed. So it happened very quickly. And when he was here, he seemed, I mean, for a 70-year-old man, he was spry and healthy and energetic, and he didn't seem sick in any way. So it was amazing to see the turn of events in less than a year.
Yeah, it's very sad to think about how quickly it turned for him. But we were talking before we started the show here. He kept a blog for these last several months while he was in the hospital, and then later I think maybe in hospice or whatever it was. And I didn't follow it the entire time, but the last few weeks I've read through a number of the posts, and it's really quite an affecting read. There's that classic idea that for the ancient Greeks, that philosophy was about learning how to die well, right? And that has a bit of a like machismo element, I think, when you think about it in terms of ancient Greek virtues and stuff like that. But there's some element of that I think is really important to think about, just in the sense of like the memento mori, right? Having the reminder of death always there is a way of humbling you and making you think more than superficially about what you do day in and day out. And especially when you're staring death right in the face as like the oncoming train, to be able to be circumspect and to say things that you want to say to your loved ones and to the outside world and people that are influenced by you. That's a pretty important position to hold, I think, over people, and to have your last days be such that you're kind of a servant to the people that you influence and that take your words very seriously. I think that's pretty great example that he put on in that blog. Were you able to read it at all?
Yeah, I skimmed bits of it. The last one that I read was I think the last entry that he wrote, where he writes like a letter to his grandchildren. Did you read that one?
Yeah.
And, he talks about how he's stardust and how he's kind of like going back, let's say, into the sort of this larger, grand cosmological system. And the grace and the patience and the wisdom and the sweetness that he exhibits in that letter is something that I find to be so lovely. He was. It's so easy, especially in activist and academic circles, to find somebody that you disagree with at an intellectual level or even at a practical level and demonize them somehow. Because we abstract away. I mean, this is what human beings do, right? So in a way, you can't get away from this entirely, but there's a way to do this better. We always are creating abstractions. Words and thoughts are abstractions from the multitude of sense data or fields of meaning or domains of meaning that are constantly surrounding us, right? We condense them into a simple word. And we do this with thinkers and people, oftentimes to the detriment of what it means to be a fully fledged subject. And I think by reading these blog entries, one of the things that reminded me of Professor Wright is the kind of complexity of what it means to be a human. That he's not just, when somebody mentions him and I have a disagreement about an area of his research, he's not just a target to distance myself from and criticize in the construction of a different project. There's something much more complete. And for me, the thing that's so fascinating is how can that recognition inform a critical engagement with the theoretical or the level of kind of abstraction that I'm saying we kind of need to be sort of aware of or maybe wary of. And that was, I think, the most striking thing by reading his blog. Because then I went back and I read this essay that you sent to me. And then it was completely different. Because I viewed him as, he kind of has that G.A. Cohen autobiographical style anyway that's very kind of revealing and very personal. And I think there's something very palatable and inviting about that. But even more so after reading how sweet he was to his grandchildren. And even more so in reading how vulnerable he was about talking about his imminent death. So, I don't know. I know we use this word and it kind of can seem cliche, but it really humanized his academic work as well.
Yeah, I think, speaking of, again, the ancients, there's this sense that philosophy is a way of life and not just sort of a form of thinking. And that's kind of been lost in especially 21st century modern academia. And you can have a successful philosophical career and, never have a moment of your life matter at all to anybody, let alone like your legacy or anything. And I think that that's unfortunate, because the holistic individual is more than just, the thoughts that they had or the words they wrote on a page. And whenever you read about, and there's been a number of pieces, sort of, almost hagiography about him since he's passed, but I read one in Jacobin this week that it just seems like there's a universal chorus from his students and people who worked with him, that he was this, incredible academic and would never sort of just succumb to groupthink or telling you what you want to hear or suckering favor or anything like that. And he was incisive in the debate room as anybody else. But then almost, I think I've heard the phrase, knew your work better than you did at times, from a number of people in reading stuff about him. And that's, I think, the mark of not only a great academic, but also a great teacher as well. And so it's pretty wonderful to hear that stuff. And I hope that encourages more people to think about how their personal life is affected and is intermixed with their academic career. Not because there's some you should feel guilty or you're an asshole or whatever if you don't, but that those things actually reinforce one another, and you actually will think better and have better ideas if you live out your convictions in this important way, and vice versa. It's like it's symbiotic, your thinking and your living.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you're critical and you're sick of Heidegger. You recently did a kind of intense read through of his earlier work, but the later Heidegger kind of talks about this tendency that he bemoans, and we could call it maybe the dominance of technological rationality. He doesn't use that phrase, but he talks about the dominance of technology. And kind of, in a very simple sense, what he means by this is that there is this tendency for human beings, which he kind of says, let's say from Descartes, to separate themselves from the world, out of the world, and the world becomes an object of inquiry, detached or distinct from the human. And what that leads to is what he calls a homelessness or a displacement of the human, right? So even though the technological reason is trying to reveal the truth of the world, what ends up happening is this paradoxical relation that precisely in the effort to reveal, there's actually a concealment, because what's concealed is the primary relation of our being in the world, right? He uses all these fucking neologisms, but the point is that the human becomes separate from the world, an alien in the world and alienated from the world, and vice versa. The world is an alien from the human and alienated from the human. And this creates this weird sense of homelessness. And I feel like the tendency that you get in a lot of academic philosophy, like kind of what you just mentioned a minute ago, where, you can kind of have this whole life, but it doesn't really impinge upon philosophy as a way of life, can really kind of be explained within this tendency, which is a metaphysical tendency, but it leads to sort of an epistemological or like a sort of embodied hermeneutic tendency, which is that we tend to create the world as something that is separate from us, and what that leads to is a sort of it leads to the tendency to need to continue to engage at that level of technological rationality, but two, it then leads to kind of a further sense of lostness or homelessness in the world. And what you see in the work of someone like Erik Olin Wright is kind of something different. That symbiosis that you're talking about could maybe map onto kind of what Heidegger's solution is to. This is why he loves poetry so much, because you have the fourfold that Heidegger talks about. And I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's like the earth, the sky, what is it? The earth, the sky, history, and something else. I can't remember what it is, but it's in spirituality or the ritual or something like that. And he wants to sort of regain this mystery of the source of being. And I think when you can have more of a symbiotic relationship between your academic work and your lived experience, or between your theoretical output and your sort of embodied experiential concerns, that creates a much richer field of analysis, a much richer orientation to the world, and it allows you to kind of view things in a way with a productive and winsome, or what he calls an effective eclecticity, right? And I think there's something about that. It kind of gets us away from this detachment, this cold rationality that you get from science or from positivism, and that actually you realize that you are embedded within these contexts. And I don't know, I feel like that there's something that characterizes Wright's work that would kind of fit within, maybe loosely at least, what Heidegger's criticism of technological rationality is, and kind of his solution towards a more sort of poetic life. Does that make any sense, Ben?
Yeah, I think the phrase you were looking for when talking about the fourfold, though, was blood and soil. You thought about
Yes, that's it. Yeah, it's earth, sky, blood, and soil. No.
Yeah, I mean, I have qualms about Heidegger on that front, but that's neither here nor there. I do think that you're absolutely right that, and this is a good segue to the essay Falling into Marxism, Choosing to Stay here. Wright is talking a lot about why did I decide to become a sociologist, and specifically a Marxist sociologist, and sort of putting together like a justification for his life's work, basically, broad justification for it. And I love that he starts out talking about, where did I start forming these beliefs in the first place? And he talks in the very beginning of the essay about when he was at Harvard, and he developed or put together a kind of experimental art film called The Chess Game. I meant to send this to you, but it's on YouTube. Have you seen it?
Oh, no, I haven't seen it. I want to, though.
Yeah, it's actually on YouTube. It's like 5 or 6 minutes long. It's, not exactly exciting, but if you read about it in this essay first, it's fun to see how it actually plays out.
Is it like stop motion?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And in the essay, he describes how the film is basically just stop motion animation, and it shows a chess game being played, and eventually the pawns revolt and replace the, what is he called? The aristocratic pieces? I can't remember if that's the phrase he uses.
I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so the pawns end up being able to move and function like knights and rooks and stuff like that.
Yeah, so then they go to the back row, and then the aristocratic pieces go to the front row.
And they'd be treated as pawns, right? Yeah.
Right.
And the basic idea being that it's the structure itself that produces these roles as symptoms. It's not the individuals themselves and their individual choices that are sort of causing the dysfunction in society or exploitation and oppression and stuff like that. And so he said, this is very early on in his formative years. He'd already had these intuitions about oppression and exploitation that were broadly aligned with socialist thinking. And then he just sort of followed those intuitions into academia. And he says in the essay that there's sort of 5 major choices that he made that he didn't just sort of necessarily fall into, but he actually had to make some sort of a choice about. 1 is becoming a Marxist, 2, becoming a sociologist, 3, becoming a multivariate Marxist, and by that he means multivariate as in combining kind of qualitative and quantitative forms of research. 4, choosing a department, and that's between Wisconsin, where he ended up for the almost entirety of his career, or Berkeley. And then finally, 5, staying a Marxist. And I really enjoyed, 1, just reading his description of his own life was very interesting, given his place in as a founding kind of socialist thinker of the late 20th century. But then also thinking about the way he thought about his own choices and how I've had to think about my own place in sort of philosophy when it comes to things like the analytic continental divide, my own background in religious studies and theology, and how I think about how that's formed me, and how I involve that in my current research, which really has nothing to do with that in a formal sense. Did you have similar sort of reflections upon reading this about your own past decisions?
I didn't as much while I was reading this, but this is a pretty consistent sort of tendency, especially when I talk with people about my biography. They ask how I found this figure, or how I got here into my current phase of research, or, when they find out that I wanted to be a pastor at one point, but then I was an actor and I was in a punk band, and they're like, what the fuck? Who are you? They're like, and it is a really scattered, it seems, I think, from the outside, and I've only picked this up because I've told the story now 1,000 times in, the 5 different countries that I've lived in to all kinds of different people, whether it's like a date situation, or whether it's like a departmental situation, or whether it's just like homies that I meet at the gym. And I didn't realize how strange of a biography it is until I've seen people's reactions, and it's the same reaction every time. It's like people are kind of perplexed, but fascinated and super curious, right? And so, when you were talking about it, I was kind of like, yeah, I think if you were talking with somebody in like a philosophy department and you kind of told them your trajectory, it wouldn't seem, formally speaking, to be a consistent trajectory. But in my mind, knowing you and having a similar sort of strange kind of path, like to me, it makes total sense. And it's a very sort of clear-cut, if albeit unorthodox, pathway, you know? So I kind of just think about that a lot. So maybe like unconsciously, like I was thinking about that stuff, but I really enjoyed hearing him talk about things and his, maybe like the kind of, it's almost like he talks about like he didn't even make the choices. They just kind of, my friend Anthony once told me, he said, sometimes our decisions make decisions. And I think Erik Olin Wright really advocates for that kind of thing, right? Like a decision that you make now kind of creates a path for the future. It opens up certain doors, it closes certain doors, it creates opportunities. I don't know. And I think the kind of like understanding how this complex journey takes place through this idea that, yeah, we have some sense of agency, but there's also this sense in which decisions make decisions for us, and then kind of reconstructing a consistent narrative retrospectively or retroactively or whatever. It's kind of an interesting exercise. And so even though I didn't think as much about myself in this, I do a lot, and I kind of really did appreciate what he was doing,
Yeah, I think that's really great to think about it in terms of the making decisions, because, a lot of people, especially those who have sort of distanced themselves from a previous set of ideological or philosophical commitments, especially ones as personally ingrained as religious commitments can be, often think about like a break, right? Or a 180 turn. And that kind of thinking, those kinds of metaphors, I think obscure the fact that there's always psychological and intentional continuity between any supposed break in one's beliefs or desires or whatever other attitudes one has. And it's difficult to think about it that way, because we like to think that the break has a much more volitional aspect to it. Like, oh, I just said, fuck that, and I moved off, right? It's very much agential. Whereas when you're thinking about the continuity aspect, it makes it almost like you're a passive in the process. And I think that's a false dichotomy. That's either a purely active or a purely passive phenomenon. It's always an intermixing between the two. And it's much easier to obscure the passive part. And it's not even really passive. It's really just, this is what thinking is. Thinking is always continuous. And to admit that up front and make that a guiding principle in your own like sense of yourself, your own biography, I think is very humbling and important, because it really makes you understand why you think the way that you do. And if you don't have that sense of why you think the way that you do, then I really don't think you have a clear grasp on your own thoughts and your own beliefs and your own thinking. And that's just, I think, a recipe for self-deception and all sorts of negative aspects that don't contribute towards clear thinking.
Yeah, I wonder why we romanticize and maybe even fetishize the sort of Paul on the road sort of moment, right? Like it's like when you have God, I just saw her and I fell in love and my whole life changed. And I knew at that moment that I wanted a family and kids, and I wanted to, get rid of my childish, immature ways, and I stopped doing drugs.
That's just revisionism, dude.
Right, but
that doesn't actually happen.
Yeah, we love those conversion stories, and I have had a traumatic experience, right? Like we've talked about it a little bit on this podcast, and in a way, I haven't done some heavy lifting with thinking through that moment, but in another way, I have done quite a bit. But I think a lot of the heavy lifting that I've done has been reinforcing a kind of romantic idea of what happened in my conversion experience when I first converted to Christianity, right? When I had that kind of like, that's it, I'm leaving Hollywood. I called my agent. I'm done. I'm going back to school. I'm going to become a pastor. But I think you're right. I think when I when I really take the time to think about who I was as a child, I was an extremely inquisitive child. And I remember when people would say things, if I perceived injustice or when I perceived somebody being rigid or dogmatic in their explanation of things, I always questioned it. And I never found it satisfying. And that has been a kind of persistent theme. So I wonder what are the consistencies, even in the midst of these perceived breaks? I think that's a really interesting kind of paradox to think through. And it's something that I think that I would love to sit down and do my own sort of Augustinian confessions one day and write about it, you know?
Yeah, you know that people always talk about, like, is it Einstein having the idea for the theory of relativity when he was on the pot? Something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I don't know about that one, but yeah, I've heard many similar things. Yeah.
Yeah, and it romanticizes this notion of, like, the muse just hits you, right? It always obscures the fact that, like thousands and thousands of hours of hard work had to exist first for that to happen. It's not like Joe on the street had the idea for the theory of relativity, right? It's fucking Einstein. So the same thing, like Paul on the road to Damascus, right? If he wasn't like a Hebrew among Hebrews, then he wouldn't have been able to reconceptualize Judaism into the Pauline version of Christianity, right? So there's all this like heavy amount of stage setting and work that has to be done first for even a radical break to occur, right? It doesn't occur out of nowhere. And yeah, to sort of understand that and to realize all the work that had to go into it for that radical break to happen, I think it's pretty important to have any sort of like clear and consistent self-conception.
Yeah, anyway. I think that's what I was going to say. I think that's why one of the things that to kind of whip that around to Wright, I think one of the ways that's nice is that he has this like dichotomy between falling into Marxism and then staying committed to Marxism. And it's that idea that, yeah, you can have the romantic, like, moment where you're out and something shocks you, an encounter with the radical other or the event or something like that. But in a vacuum, that, that's just a moment. It's a flash. It's an upsurge. Not that those things don't have import, not that they can't be transformative, not that they can't even be radically other. They can, but this idea of falling into Marxism is kind of like falling in love. But what really matters is how do we understand that in relation to this idea of how our decisions make decisions? These like other compulsions, these commitments. And I was thinking about this actually when I was in the shower when inspiration struck, Troy. But I think one of the things that I find difficult for somebody like myself that I find admirable in Erik Olin Wright is commitment is a self-limitation, right? And I think that's the thing that is frightening to me. When something is limiting from the outside, it's an obstacle to be overcome, right? It's a challenge that is presented, and I love that. I love a puzzle. I love a challenge. I love an obstacle. I love a mystery. I think that's not a self-imposition. That's something that is presented from without that I believe I can overcome. Now, maybe that's because of like some sort of self-confidence or something like that. But nevertheless, when a challenge is presented, it comes from without. But what Erik Olin Wright is talking about here is this idea of the commitment of kind of staying with Marxism is this notion of commitment. And for me, that's something that is frightening because it's a self-imposition. And it's recognizing that you're cutting yourself off from this possibility of choice, from this possibility of options. And I think there's something really admirable, actually, about kind of exploring that kind of tension between those two. Having both the romantic spark, having both the sort of encounter with the thing, whether it's a challenge or something to embrace or whatever, but then at the same time, limiting yourself and setting those restrictions so that your future decisions make decisions, but it's a self-imposition of decisions, Yeah,
it's the classic, I talk about this a lot in like music and the arts, right, where you can only be creative within self-imposed constraints. And I think, it may be easy for someone who like went to Harvard and studied at Oxford and had a choice between Berkeley and Wisconsin and is this, famous scholar who's, probably been very well off the vast majority of his life. I think both of his parents were also professors in Kansas when he was growing up. It's easy for him to talk about the romantic side and putting self-constraints on and finding your niche within that. And that's probably true to some respect, but I mean, it would have been very easy for, I think, Wright to just do quantitative sociological research that was humdrum and just like everybody else, and kind of follow the status quo and have a successful career, and that's that. And choosing to do explicitly Marxist sociology maybe would have been easier in his time than it would be now. I'm not really sure exactly how. Sociology is probably a little more open to that stuff than maybe like political science. But that's a constraint, and that probably, for the vast majority of people at that time, given the the uncertainty factors, would not have been a great career decision in terms of making sure that the most people got access to your work and that you had the biggest political effect. But then Wright's research, and especially on stuff like class and class consciousness, was so innovative that it became more influential than he would have been if he had done status quo quantitative research by himself and not focused on Marxist concepts like class. So maybe it's survivorship bias, right? That he made it, but most people wouldn't be able to do that. That wouldn't happen for most. But I think it's nice to look back on that and see how the self-constraints actually worked out really well. It may not do that all the time. There may be more failures than not, right? Most of the takes of like a bebop record in the 60s based entirely on sort of just playing off one another don't work out very well. But the one that does is the best, right? Is it better than if it had just sort of followed the rules?
Yeah. So had you read this essay before, or was this kind of, he passed away and you said, I kind of want to like read a little bit about him, or were you familiar with this already?
No, I think it was actually Peter Frace from Jacobin who had sort of tweeted out about this essay. I hadn't heard of it before. I had read some of the things by Wright before, and of course, like the little essay, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century, is one I've read before, and bits of Envisioning Real Utopias and some different articles he's put online and stuff like that. But this was brand new to me. I was curious to ask you, Austin, the first choice he talks about, becoming a Marxist, he talks about whether he wanted to be a Marxist explicitly or just be a kind of quote-unquote post-Marxist, someone who uses Marxist concepts but only for their use, and then kind of forgets the kind of conceptual behemoth that is Marxism. You're going to work within Marxism or just use it as when it suits you. And he chose to do the behemoth, right? To take on being an actual Marxist sociologist. Because he says there's just kind of two ways you can be a Marxist. One is to be a theory builder, where you construct big paradigms. And then the other is to be kind of an eclectician, where you just kind of use disparate strands of things when they are useful to you, and you usually criticize the big theory builders, and then there's this dialectical relationship where the theory builders respond to those criticisms by adjusting their big paradigms, and then the eclecticians come back and criticize those using whatever tools they find around. What do you think about that idea? Because I found it pretty enticing.
Me too. Because this is one of the more, I guess, central issues that concerns me of late, or that has concerned me of late. And I think I've found myself getting kind of frustrated with a lot of left discourse. I mean, let's say particularly online, because it seems to be very much concerned with just sort of accepting received interpretations and then using them for like policy prescription or for writing think pieces or something along those lines. Whereas the idea of actually reconstructing the actual conceptual apparatus is something that is not as common. And I am much more inclined towards that project, the reconstruction of the actual abstract, conceptual, and lived, because I don't think of conceptual as being something that is not embodied. I mean, it's hard for me because I feel like I have to do a lot of legwork in describing this, but, coming out of the existentialist tradition, when I think of concepts as being lived. When I think of logic, I think of it as being something that's lived. I mean, this will be explored more in my book, and hopefully, when the book is released, we can do like some sort of, like, I don't know, seminar, like book club or something going through it, because then maybe that'll give some clarification to some of the ways that I view things without having to do like without having to qualify every single time I open my mouth. But I feel like I need to because when I think of things as being like a reconceptualization or a reconstruction of the conceptual apparatuses, it's not just a theoretical seminar room academic exercise. It's something that exists when I'm at the bar. It's something that exists when I'm at the food bank. It's something that exists when I'm working with children with special needs. It's something that exists when I'm spending time with my family. It's something that exists in the academic setting when I'm teaching students or when I'm in a reading group. It exists in all of those things because I don't separate the two. I can't. Now, I think I can abstract from the two and I can do an analysis of the differences between when I'm playing basketball on Sunday with my homies here or when I'm, working through a text for a journal article or something like that. Of course, there's something different that's going on, but I think of it as a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind. So for me, this idea of this distinction that he makes really fits well into some of my own concerns with trying to fit how it is that I view that maybe more synthetic project of bringing all of these things together in a synthesis. I mean, not synthetic like fake, but a synthesis of things that I view kind of my project as embodying. And how that fits into what I view as what I tend to call popular political analysis or popular political discourse, which I think is kind of driven by this positivistic instrumental rationality that uses Marxian concepts or that uses anti-capitalist concepts to kind of just reproduce received wisdom, which I find to be quite frustrating and limiting, even if it's useful. And he's trying to kind of like balance between these two projects, I think, in a lot of ways. At least that's how I read it in my kind of own and mapping it onto my personal journey. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that in addition to his more theoretical understanding of that dialectic, I think the one you're talking about is at least implicit there too. And, he talks about when choosing a department, there's this one circumstance where he has the ability to choose between Wisconsin and Berkeley, and he's trying to decide which sociology department would be better for him. And he kind of sets up this neat little dichotomy where he says the Wisconsin department was a discipline-oriented department in terms of sociology, and it focuses on major sociological problems and the big issues, whereas Berkeley was more of an intellectually oriented department, focusing on big ideas wherever they come from European circles, more Anglo-American circles, whatever. And that he could either be a disciplinary maverick at the intellectually oriented Berkeley, and he'd be arguing against the postmodernists about the ability to know anything. Thought that was a pretty cute little section. Or he can be an intellectual maverick at Wisconsin, arguing with disciplinary-minded scholars about the need for bold new voices and using things from outside of sociology and, of course, from Marxism to challenge the discipline itself. I thought that was a really fun way of thinking about that, a little dialectic too, and that he thought either way would have been fine, and he could have probably done good work, but that he was better prepared and suited for being the intellectual maverick at a disciplinary-minded department like Wisconsin. I think that gets to that lived area as well, right? Like this is talking about how do you deal with people, and what are you suited for in terms of bringing ideas that will help a community flourish, not just whose like papers are you going to read and which students are going to best do the grunt work when it comes to sociological quantitative research, going out and doing surveys and shit like that, right? So that was a pretty interesting way of developing that lived scholar dialectic as well.
Do you think that do you get a sense of why he ends up making the decision that he makes? Like, is there something about his makeup that makes him better inclined towards one thing? Because he kind of mentions it, but do you think, like, what do you think it is that ultimately caused him to choose Wisconsin over Berkeley?
Yeah, I didn't get the sense that there was an explicit reason, unless you saw something that I didn't. But I would guess temperament probably has a lot to do with it, right? I was thinking myself, if I was in a similar situation in like philosophy, right? Do I want to go somewhere that's an intellectual vanguard and has continental postmodernists talking to analytic philosophers, talking to like logical positivists and linguistic turn people and all these different things together, that seminar room would be chaos as fuck, and I would not flourish in that. Whereas I do enjoy taking disparate ideas from all different sources, but there has to be like a through line of what exactly are we working on here. And so I probably have a temperament more suited to like what Wright's talking about, being a little bit more of an intellectual maverick and a disciplinary oriented community. That probably suits me better. I would guess you're probably the opposite, though, right?
Yeah, I don't know. It's funny. I think I would, because you talk about the chaos in that seminar room, and I'm like, oh man, that would be so stimulating. Like I want to be in there with the Butlerian discursive performativity theorists and the analytical Marxists and the I don't know, the hermeneuticians and people who are kind of all trying to think through how to synthesize these ideas together. Because I think for me, in that storm, in that fire, what happens is that the concepts themselves become problematized. The ideas themselves become nuanced and twerked. The abstractions are seen from a different perspective, I think in one sense, like hermeneutically or like methodologically, let's say, like I'm very much indebted to the phenomenological approach, where it's looking at things from another side and realizing that there's an infinite depth in that. And I know a lot of people are. I'm not saying like that somehow I'm like unique in that, but I think that's really potent for me. So for me, I love the different perspectives approach, because what I like to do is I like to see how it is that I can look at the object of inquiry from all of these various, as Merleau-Ponty refers to it as Abschätzung, these sort of these presentations, these different viewings, these perceptions from these different angles of the object of inquiry. Because I think what that does is that transforms the object of inquiry. It changes it, and then it also changes our orientation to it, and then that kind of like works outward and makes other connections as we leave the seminar room and we go to a different seminar room where someone's talking about cyber warfare or something else that's completely different than we were just talking about housing inequality, Like, you're able to make these strange connections with things that didn't seem possible, and in the process, it completely transforms the way that we approach things, but it helps us to not just change ourselves, which I think is really important and something that I'm fascinated with, but the reason that it changes ourselves is because it actually changes the object of inquiry itself, right? It's this dialectical relationship between subjectivity and objectivity. It's not just a pure object that reveals itself that in its own essence or something like that, but rather it's a recognition of how it is that the object is informed, if you will, through the methodological process of inquiry. And I love doing that from as many different perspectives as possible. So I find that to be extremely exciting, if not anxiety-inducing, because it never ends, right?
Yeah, no, but, and I appreciate the idea that, this is controversial. I think a lot of people hate this idea, but they're both right.
Yes,
and they're both philosophy. Also, it's not that philosophy is one or the other, or that one's philosophy and one's theory or something.
And it's not that one is better than the other objectively, which is also really hard to say, right? Yeah, because
then you get the problem of better or what, and then you get into philosophical territory again.
Yes, exactly.
Which is contested. So yeah, I think it's great to have the level of self-awareness that he has here, and noticing that he could have done either of these things and they both would have been fine. And he hopefully would have done good work in either department. And that, dialogue between those two can be helpful too, or at least you can't really be like dedicated to one or the other, to like the intellectual side or the discipline side. There's always going to be some level of give and take, and you have to kind of find where your temperament and form of thinking is best suited to do good work, while realizing the whole time that you can learn a ton from people on the other side. And that if you don't, then you're sort of missing out on good critiques and good challenges to your own thinking.
Yeah. No, I agree. And you know what? Like for me, when I go to use his his framework here, when I go to a more like disciplinary oriented department or environment, like I actually find it to be really refreshing for me, because one of my frustrations with myself is that I have a very scattered like field of inquiry, a very scattered set of concerns and interests and resources that I draw from. Partly because of my intellectual makeup, going from studying religion to kind of political theology to continental philosophy of religion to studying philosophy proper to like political economy. So part of it is scattered because of the training that I've received or the environments that I've been in or the resources that I've gleaned from. But also I think part of the reason I've been drawn to those environments is because I have a problem with that notion of self-limitation, right? Like that idea of committing myself to the discipline is difficult for me. So when I do find myself in a singularly focused disciplinary environment, I actually find it to be really, it is seductive to me in a different way because it's very peaceful, I just don't know how long I always last, like how I would last in those environments. That's why you make fun of me when you say that I would only last a few weeks in the wilderness, and I romanticize it because it seems very peaceful to me, It's like the singular vision. It's the limitation of choices. It's commitment to the thing, to the singular thing, which is always very difficult for me.
Yeah, what was the movie where the guy goes to into the wild?
Into the Wild, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. When you watch that movie, is the fact that he didn't make it a success or a failure? That tells you a lot about how you're thinking about these things.
Right. Yeah, no, I see that definitely. One of the things that I think is interesting that Erik Olin Wright gets criticized for is a sort of reformulation of this notion of class, right? So he does a lot of examination on the idea of the middle class as being a segment of society that is torn between those who own the means of production and those who are exploited workers, right? And a lot of, like, let's say more orthodox Marxist or class-based analyses, they would find this to be problematic because it doesn't quite fit in with the binary between bourgeois and proletariat, right? But this is precisely one of those areas that I think there's actually a lot of productive work that's done by reconstructing the conceptual formulations. And that I think really helps us to understand, like myself, like I am dissatisfied with the binary of capital and labor, of bourgeois and proletariat. And one of the things that, and this is so, I told Troy before we started recording, for people who are listening, that I feel bad because my last interaction with Professor Wright was actually me being critical of his work. But I loved him, and it was in the seminar room, so it was obviously productive and respectful. But one of the things I questioned him about was how he fails to consider what we might refer to as like the libidinal economy or the construction of class relations themselves, and that my concern is that if we just simply accept the notion of class as been constructed through Marxist formulations based on the valorization process of extracted labor in this kind of like binary setting, even if we want to account for this notion of like a middle class or something like that, that really misses out on kind of like other aspects of what value is, what meaning is, what is value creation, outside of these sort of like technological modes of analysis that Marxism seems to focus on. And we had a really nice discussion about it, so there was only a small amount of guilt when I think about how my last interaction with him was. I wish I could have just given him a hug and said thank you for your work, But that's one of the things, though, even though I disagree with his conclusions, that I find so powerful and productive about what he calls his effective eclecticism, right? With both being disciplinary focused, but also being interested in like cafeteria theory and kind of embracing these different things. Just for me, because I think he might veer more to the sides of like the disciplinary focus. He still remains a little bit more, and I don't mean conservative in the political sense, but let's say a little bit more traditional in his formulations, whereas I would want to be even kind of a little bit more experimental, right? But nevertheless,
conservative, small c conservative is the right word for it.
Yeah, he is, right? Kind of like G.A. Cohen, we would say, is a little small c conservative sometimes, and maybe those, right? And obviously he was his student, so, and I see a lot of Cohen when I read him, actually. Now,
yeah, for sure, especially in the writing style,
right?
Yeah, and this idea of contradictory class locations that you're talking about, I think it's exactly right to say that it's this right blend, no pun intended, of the disciplinary focus on class, but then reformulating it in such a way that is new and is based on sociological study and all the different international surveys and work that they had done quantitatively. and that's the right kind of disciplinary work that can then, or is at least then able to interface with this more intellectual vanguard variegated approach that comes from something like that you're interested in. That's the kind of stuff that can have a proper dialectical relationship, the kind that he's talking about in this essay, where the system builders do their work and then the eclecticians come and they critique it from whatever source they have available and produce this productive conversation. There's ways in which both sides of those can go wrong, where the disciplinary focus is so like self-involved in its own little word games that it's incapable of having any productive conversation outside of that little game. And I think analytic philosophy can fall into that sometimes. And also with the intellectual vanguard side of being so chaotic and unfocused that it's almost just like throwing shit against the wall and seeing what sticks. It's sort of it's more of just like a literary approach than it is like a philosophical approach. And that can happen sometimes too. And neither of those are very productive as far as working with each other. And I'm pretty happy with the fact that it seems like analytic and continental philosophy over the last couple of decades and hopefully into the future are having a much more productive conversation from both sides. Analytic philosophers, like Galen Strawson has written a little bit of stuff on like narrative identity that I've really enjoyed. On the continental side, people like Marcus Gabriel and Kenton Meyesu and Badiou, of course, have done work that's brought in different sources from the Anglo-American tradition. And that's been, I think, a huge boon for both sides as far as getting out of a little bit of a like the rut it seems like both those sides got into when left on their own.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot with myself. I feel like at the moment right now, if someone were to be like, what does Austin think? I mean, I'm still super young. I'm in my 30s, so, and like, I haven't even published my first book yet. It's not even out until this year, right? So it's not like I'm somebody to really wrestle with.
You haven't even been able to have a late phase Austin yet.
Yeah, right? I mean, but like if somebody listened...
disavow all your work.
Right. But I mean, like if somebody listened to all the podcasts and that I've done on all the various platforms and, read things that I've written in popular publications or academic things, and then let's say they read my book, I think the one shitty thing about my output thus far is that for me, I still think I need to say, like, I'm still developing. So everything that I say ends with an ellipses. You know what I mean? And for me, that's okay because I view what I'm doing as like a lifelong project. And after I die, if I do have the opportunity to continue to produce output like this in whatever medium, and let's say I publish 10 books in my lifetime and, a few dozen articles and thousands of podcasts and whatever else I do, at the end of my life, then I feel like at that point, then you can say, this is what Austin produced. This is who Austin was, that sort of thing. But in the middle of it, like in medias res, I'm kind of like, wait and see. And I know that can be very frustrating for people because the other approach, the kind of, let's say, I know with this binary is oftentimes kind of like a forced fabrication, but let's say the analytic school of thought, you can really get what somebody's thinking from a short précis that they write. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think one of the things that like I'm especially trying to develop more is that other side of truly being clear with what it is that I'm trying to articulate in a packaged presentation for people. And that's just harder for me. I'm much more of like this flowy, and I think it comes from, I'm sure there are personal things as well, but let's say intellectually, it really comes from the influence of like Spinoza and Nietzsche in particular, and Deleuze, and Sartre. For Sartre, the idea is you are what you're not, and you're not what you are. You are in the process of becoming. So this idea of process philosophy, I've been really influenced by Bergson and Whitehead and these process types of thinkers. And so for me, it's very difficult to kind of break from that. But at the same time, I know that that's not enticing to a lot of people because it's not as easy to digest. Where somebody like Erik Olin Wright, I think, does a really good job of trying to do both, but maybe kind of falling to the other side, that he's much clearer. Like you read that little essay and you're like, cool, I know what, like the one that's, what is it, the orientations to capitalism against the four orientations of, what is it, the four oppositional orientations?
Yeah, little essay is how to be an anti-capitalist in the 21st century.
Yeah, and he talks about like these 4 different orientations to like be an anti-capitalist, right? You know, smashing the state, taming the state, eroding the state, and escaping, right? Those are like the 4. And and when you read that little essay, you're like, perfect. I kind of get this guy, you know? Whereas for me, if you said that after you wrote an essay of mine, I would feel anxious. Right? Even if I had an idea, a singular idea that I wanted to communicate, if at the end you stopped and you said, this is what you think, I would be anxious. Because I'd be like, no, this is what I think, and then I'm indicating towards this, and I want those other fields of potency that are surrounding, the virtual fields, I want those things to be felt and to be embedded within it so that there's like this endless elaboration, you know, like that's what I want. Whereas if you packaged it down, I would feel anxious.
And you know what I love about this essay is, and Wright says this explicitly in the beginning, is that there's a necessary symbiotic relationship between those two. Like, if the system builder who writes the 12-page essay where it just encapsulates all of their work, if that didn't exist, that thing which makes you anxious if you had to do it yourself didn't exist, then there would be nothing for the eclecticians to actually work on, because they are not in a bad way, but parasitic on the paradigms in a good way, in the good form of parasite. Whereas the system builders need those eclecticians to do that parasitic work, the good parasitic work, so they can then be spurred on to adjust the systems.
Because they introduce novel concepts.
Exactly, right?
Right.
And so keeping in mind that relationship, I think, is like, it's just a super healthy way to think about one's interaction with other sources of thought. And one's own, to kind of bring this back to what we're talking about originally, the evolution of one's thought, the continuity in one's thinking. Keeping that in mind, in part, is keeping this big picture in mind of how the whole intellectual sphere, which is out there, which influences each of us, how we interact with it, and that we're not just like a singular mind developing our ideas in isolation from the rest of the intellectual world. No, it's all in this deeply embedded symbiotic relationship. And it's a really short essay here, but I think it's really beautiful and kind of bringing out that really important kind of macro level thought.
Mm.
It's always great when you can tell someone not in philosophy has been sort of trained in philosophy in some way.
Right. Yeah, I had this discussion with a buddy of mine recently, and he was talking about, just like frustrations, the kind of like wanky academic conversations that philosophy types have when they go to a coffee shop. And one of the things I think I said is that I kind of feel like the role of the philosopher is a lot of times to be misunderstood. And I don't know if I think this as like an absolute general truth, but I definitely think at least my orientation and my experience of philosophy is that the philosopher is like the John the Baptist type, He's the crazy motherfucker in the wilderness. It's eating locusts and saying like, guys, he's preparing the way for the truth, let's say. And then the truth is like the sort of embodiment of it, the institutionalization of it, the encapsulation of it, right? And I don't mean that in the bad way of institutionalization. But for me, for some reason, it's that tension of, like, I don't want to be institutionalized, And I think part of the reason, too, that I, like, romanticize figures like Sartre, he, like, refused awards, and he was like, I refuse to be institutionalized, right? Like, I won't accept this prize in literature, right? Like, that kind of shit. Because how dare you try to institutionalize me and encapsulate me within your power structures. But I think that comes from maybe sort of a false understanding of negative freedom. This idea that you can truly be freed from without also recognizing that you're also embedded within other sort of institutional structures and that you can't get away from the two. And maybe the better dialectical approach is to figure out how to navigate between the two, to not just be the crazy fucker that's running through the streets screaming like some of the situationists did and the surrealists did in France when they would do crazy shit, or like avant-garde artists. Like, sure, that has a place, but at the same time, just because you have an academic post and you are teaching in a cushy position, that doesn't mean that you also aren't an integral part of helping to formulate these ideas and these notions. And I think the last thing that I kind of wanted to say is I wanted to bring this to kind of this tension that you oftentimes see between what it means to be an activist and what it means to be an academic. And a lot of times, especially for lefty types, if you're a left academic, you can be sort of shit on or spat upon by activist types because you're perceived as being this institutionalized, cozy, petit bourgeois, whereas the real work is done in the disruption. The real work is done in the streets. The real work is done in the chaos that is like opening things up. And I have thought that for a long time, but more recently in the last couple of years, I've had my thoughts challenged by people that I respect, who are both activists and academic types, who have mentioned people to me in academic departments who I kind of thought were more conservative, let's say small c conservative, petit bourgeois intellectual types, but who I didn't realize behind the scenes were fighting for teachers' unions, and were fighting to help to have better student accommodation, and we're fighting for these larger principles that are part of the class struggle, that are part of the anti-capitalist orientation, that are part of trying to create a better world. So I wanted to throw it to you and say, do you see this tension as well in this essay, as Wright is justifying his position as a cushy petit bourgeois academic, but is also an integral active component in this larger anti-capitalist struggle?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about a lot in the last few years too, especially since the last couple of years when things kind of the shit hits the fan a little bit politically in the States here. And that there's, I think, a really fine line, and it's sometimes difficult to discern where it is, between doing the work that you're best at in terms of contributing towards the social good, the ultimate social good, and just being where you're comfortable. And in a way that's, sometimes unproductive for the ultimate social good. And it's hard to find that, but I think that's the struggle that especially I think academics really have to find, because you might, from all external perspective, be in your ivory tower just doing your work, right? But really, especially, I've been teaching the last 5 or 6 years, what's more on the ground than teaching students, especially if you're like in a college where you're dealing with mostly people who are going to end up being working class, middle class, not people who are going to end up, making 6 figures, being the power brokers in society. That's a responsibility that you have towards other people. And I don't think it's wrong to sort of dedicate yourself towards a smaller, maybe have a smaller effect on the world, but greater overall impact on that smaller group you're having an effect on, than leading a revolution tomorrow, or doing the big impact stuff, which if you don't do it well and you don't do it in a way that's prudent, can end up backfiring or being ineffective. That's a really hard sort of decision to make, or discussion to have with yourself about your own work and what you're best suited for. But I think it's an important one to keep in mind whenever you're sort of trying to justify yourself to yourself. To be careful not to excuse comfortability, right? But then also realize that we don't need to have this kind of narrow idea that we have to change the world with our ideas like immediately. That patient hard work can be better sometimes than like a firecracker.
Yeah, I think that kind of ties back into the idea that we are so caught up in the romantic idea of falling in love, right? We want the event. And French philosophy is oftentimes, like Sartre and Badiou are oftentimes criticized for fetishizing the French Revolution, right? They fetishize these big moments. And we do. In our world today, like, we fetishize big figures. We fetishize the big event. We attribute the big event as being this singular transformative moment that somehow opened up a new paradigm and changed everything. And I think there's some truth to that, but at the same time, you can fetishize that to the neglect of, like you mentioned earlier, about consistency and continuity. And I don't know. I think that's something to really interesting to kind of work through and think through. And it's something that I have been thinking through a lot lately. If not in the forefront of my consciousness, it's always kind of like working in the background a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's important just to say that the events do have radical effects, and there's a radical break there, right? But you couldn't possibly have a radical break unless the stage was set for that to happen, right? A vase can't break unless it's structurally weak. And so there's the stage has to be set in that way for the event to have the radical impact break. It's not an either or. It's not a pure continuity or a radical break and surprise and newness and novelty. It's both.
Yeah, like a volcano doesn't just erupt because of a spark, right? There's millions of years of geological activity and pressures, and the situation culminates into a singular contracted moment. But it's both and. There has to be a spark, but at the same time, the conditions have to be right. The spark isn't a sufficient cause.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I think it was great to kind of like delve into this. I would definitely recommend for people to read this little essay. You can just Google and you can find it. It's open access. What's it called again for people to check out?
Falling into Marxism, Choosing to Stay. And I'd also recommend reading How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century as a good encapsulation of the ideas in envisioning real utopias and Wright's overall kind of theoretical work.
Cool. Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes so that people can have a quick link. But if you want to just Google it.
You can really easily Google both of them now. Yeah. They're available on the internet.
Exactly. So rest in peace, Erik Olin Wright. Thank you for your contributions. Definitely, I think for people out there that are interested, look into his work, read his blog. I think you can just Google Erik Olin Wright blog, and you should be able to find it pretty easy. I can't remember what it's called. Do you remember what it's called? Yeah,
I forgot. It had a weird...
Yeah.
The site that's hosted on, it's kind of strange sounding.
Yeah. But you can check it out, and it's a fascinating kind of journey and portrait of somebody who is facing his imminent death, and he's very vulnerable, and at the same time has like a winsome and wise approach to his final words that he wants to kind of leave on this earth. So really fascinating. Thanks, Troy, for recommending this.
Yeah, rest in power.
All right, sweet. So now we'll head to our final segment of the episode. This is the Sticky Leaves. It's where one of us gets to recommend something that is giving us meaning or hope or joy in a world that is oftentimes devoid of such things. It's Troy's turn this week. What is making you happy, brother?
So I had a whole thing planned for the Sticky Leaves this week, but then last night, not last night, but the night before last, I went into a concert where I saw Tim Hecker. Have you heard him before?
No, but I saw your tweet.
Yeah, so Tim Hecker's a Canadian ambient musician, producer, all sorts of things. And he's been one of my favorites kind of experimental ambient musicians for a number of years now. Probably one of my all-time favorite ambient albums is his 2013 album, Virgins. And I'd always heard that his shows were very unique and different and an experience and something worth seeing. And so I finally went to go see him, and he played at the Masonic Lodge at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Have you ever been there?
I've been to the cemetery, but I've never been to the Masonic Lodge.
Yeah, so I'd never even been in the cemetery. It's famous around here in LA, but I'd never actually been there. And I didn't really get to experience the cemetery very much because it closes at like 3 p.m. or something, and there's no lights really anywhere, so it's just pitch black. But the Masonic Lodge was super cool. It definitely felt like a bit of a horror movie vibe. Like you definitely could have had people fainting, and then all of a sudden there's like ghostly apparitions everywhere, and we find ourselves inside of a movie. But the show was unlike anything I think I've ever experienced. Just for some background, his most recent album is a work he did with a Japanese ensemble on Japanese classical music, which is called Gagaku or something like that. And he sort of takes this Japanese classical music and kind of reorients it and uses bits of noise and different sound textures to make this kind of ambient pieces. And one thing about ambient music that I get kind of frustrated with is a lot of people think of ambient music as being sort of passive listening experience.
Like elevator music or something.
Well, I mean, I think elevator music has a connotation of just being bad, like muzak.
Right.
But as being passive, but maybe in a good way, like let the music wash over you, is what people always say. They use the metaphor of washing and of the oceanic feeling. And like there's an element to that, especially for some ambient music, where I think that's the point. But Hecker's music is not like that at all. It's extremely active listening. At least it should be. I don't know what you would get out of it if you weren't listening to it actively. He likes to sort of hide melodies and pieces you can kind of catch on to in little hooks, like behind all kinds of noise and arrhythmic sections, and all sorts of different stuff, and depending upon the album that you're thinking of. And the experience listening to this, it's incredibly loud. You don't expect that from ambient music. Like, ambient music is usually quieter and more reflective, right? But this was like punishingly loud at certain points, to the point where at this Masonic Lodge, which was got to be many, many decades old, it felt like the whole building was crumbling around you. It was scary at points. Like, you thought the world is ending. It got apocalyptic at certain moments with the level of noise, and where you can feel the bass in your heart, and the noises are sort of coming from every direction. I think one thing I heard about his music that I really appreciated, as far as how to conceptualize listening to it, is imagine yourself in the middle of an extremely dense forest, and you hear music coming from somewhere, but you can't place which direction it's coming from. So there's a bit of cacophony there, but it's not cacophony to the point where it's disorienting, unless you allow it to be. I think you can sort of close your eyes and pick out parts of the music, whether it's the noise or the things behind the noise or whatever it is, and then follow them and see where they take you. And the way you can do if you're in this dense forest and you don't know which direction, just pick a direction and start going. And so I would encourage anybody out there to go and check out Tim Hecker's music, because I absolutely love it. And it's a totally different experience with music than I think anybody else makes. I'm not super into the ambient scene or anything, so I'm sure there's other stuff out there that's just as eclectic and experimental and interesting. But his stuff is the stuff that I've found the most intriguing of anybody in that scene. And seeing him live was an experience that I've never had before, and I would absolutely love to try it again. In terms of re-experiencing it with this whole new outlook. I probably wouldn't encourage anybody out there to listen to his newest album as an entryway, since it's a bit different, and even more formless than his previous work. I would definitely encourage them to go and look at his 2013 album that I mentioned earlier, Virgins. I think that's a really good way to introduce yourself to it. Just like put the album on your phone, get some good over-ear headphones, turn the lights off, close your eyes, and imagine yourself in the forest and kind of chase around the different parts of the music. I've done that before with that album, Virgins, and it's a really, really cool experience, and unlike anything you have with pop music. So definitely try that. And see Hecker live.
You've been seeing a lot of live shows lately, huh?
Yeah, I always do, though.
Yeah?
I usually go to about a
maybe
show
you've just been tweeting about it more. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. I don't tweet the stuff that I'm embarrassed about, so. If I go see Death Cab for Cutie, no one's going to know about it but me. Well, if I told you, then that would kind of defeat the purpose, dude.
That's a good point. I mean, do you feel like Tim Hecker's music, it almost does a disservice to listen to it, a recorded version? Is it like theater where it loses a little bit if you listen to the cast recording or something?
Yeah, I'm wondering about that. Since I've seen the show now, am I going to listen to his music differently? Or is it going to be like disappointing when it's quiet, or whatever? I'm interested to see how that works out for me. But I think maybe this new album that he has, I won't be able to hear it the same way. But the older ones, I think they'll have their own little place in my experience. But yeah, I do think it wouldn't be surprising if his new album, which just the record is so much more quiet and introspective on the record, and live it was at points it was reflective and intimate and introspective in certain parts, but other parts had this dynamic of just overwhelming you with like apocalyptic fury. And that's something you're only going to get live.
No, I think that sounds awesome. I mean, I don't know who it is. I don't know who he is. I mean, and I don't really know if I'd even say that I could tell you I understand even what ambient music is. Like, I understand the terms, but like I don't know anybody in that field or whatever. But the way you describe the concert, like that's my vibe. Like that's the kind of shit that I love. I love being in those types of immersive environments, you know? Like that's 100% me. So for me, it's like I don't know, like I'm not thrilled to go out and buy an album now, right? Like even if I turn off the lights, like you say, and smoke a joint and like totally zone out and like get lost in the forest, like yeah, that sounds cool, it sounds good, but like going to the show, if you were like, hey dude, in Sydney, he's gonna be there and he's gonna be doing this at some weird funky ass old building or whatever, I'm like, I'm there. You know what I mean? Like that gets me really going.
Yeah, I think you would have loved the just newness and novelty of the experience. And I should add also, one cool aspect of it is during the show, even before, an hour before they came on, the entire room was filled with smoke from a smoke machine. And so you can't see anything but vague outlines of the people on the stage. So they're just kind of formless beings. You can't see what they're really playing or what they're doing. They're just kind of there. And there's like one solid primary color that fills the room with light. And it changed from purple during the more introspective parts to red during the fury parts. So I thought that it's very minimalistic in that sense, visually, which is good, I think, because it's meant to say, don't pay attention to the visuals. This is an oral experience. And maybe it's a little paternalistic that way, but I appreciated it because I am, and I think all human beings are prone towards putting the visual first, and escaping that and focusing on the oral really, I think, helps maximize the experience.
See, do you think it's paternalistic, or do you think it's just another layer of affect that it's employing?
Yeah, I totally think that it's the latter, but I can see why someone might be like, "Oh, come on, man! Don't
stop!
This is
stop holding
don't
my
tell
hand.
Me how to listen to your music."
Yeah, right.
Oh man, you're the fucking expert. You tell me how to listen to your music, all right? If I want to listen to Carly Rae Jepsen, then I'll do that on my own time.
Hey, I just met you. Am I down crazy?
Don't even fucking do it.
Here's
dude.
my number, so call me, baby, or whatever it is. Yeah. Not. I mean, I can't pretend like I don't know the song. I know. I worked at a goddamn summer camp with kids. Okay. I danced to that song many a time in the summer of 2014. Well, cool. We'll go ahead and wrap up the episode there then. Good chat. Appreciate you, brother. For people who are listening, if you want to follow us on Insta, you can. I'm dying. If you want to follow us on Insta, you can. It's owls_at_dawn. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can. It's the same, owls_at_dawn. You can email us, owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. If you could leave us a 5-star review or rating, and then leave us a review. If you ask a question, we'll go ahead and ask that question at the front of the show. We'll engage with you that way. Patreon.com/owlsatdawn if you want to support the show or get access to bonus content. Am I missing anything else?
Don't forget about the Mubi.com/owlsatdawn sponsorship we got going on. If you want to go to that website, you can get a 1-month free trial of Mubi, as mentioned earlier in the episode.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I think that's pretty much it.
But just one more thing, dude.
Oh, what's that?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.